Today, I want to talk about the design gap. So, the design gap is made of aesthetics. So, essentially, with a lot of things in society, you have kind of a gap between, say, rich and poor. There's a have and have not. So, this is kind of obvious with things like property, like how much space can you use for what you want to do, food, and health. Rich people can usually afford to eat a little bit better. The nutrition of their food is a little bit better. The design gap, essentially, what it comes about when beauty is owned. So the problem here is that the design gap, not that people don't know it exists or there aren't other serious gaps out there, but just that it's underrated. When it comes to things like obvious things like nutrition and subsistence, a place to live, the effects are obvious. If you don't eat, you'll go hungry, right? If you don't have good nutrition, you'll have disease. Just because it's not as obvious doesn't mean it's not as serious. One problem with prioritizing functionality over aesthetics is that a lot of the time their value goes hand in hand. We're kind of trapped up here. Our perception to the outside world is filtered through our senses. And what something actually does, we hope it doesn't kill us, but when it comes to anything other than that, any usefulness that we get from something, the way that we perceive what it does is the only access that we have to what it actually does. When you study user experience and interface design, one thing that you realize really quickly is that when people have a functionality that they know something that they have in their hand does. For example, if they can't figure out how to do it, it causes more stress than if they didn't have that functionality at all. So we know that stress, of course, leads to health concerns the same way that something like a bad environment would, pollution would. And even simpler, if you have something and you don't know how to use it, then you won't be able to use it. You might as well not even have it in the first place. So not only is it useless, but it's actually worse than useless. So to define aesthetics very broadly as the way something is perceived, the way that a good is perceived, a positive perception of something, is say that a functionality actually has an effect on the person who the function is performed for. Whether it's clothing, whether it's architecture, or whether it's interior design, so the place you live, what you wear, the objects that you have on you, so your phone, your headphones, right? Everything that you interact with in your life right now, the way that it works is when you buy something, you have to pay a premium for something with design. So that means good choices were made when it was designed. So say it's easy to use, it's user friendly, it's simplified, right? If you're going to pay less for something that's functional, it's going to be more complicated and more unfriendly. You're going to buy the actual object, so usually high quality stuff is made in smaller runs, so the overhead cost is bared directly by you instead of being able to spread that overhead cost among a large population of people. And of course the culture is that you should buy the thing at least expense that's functional, but of course the functionality of it is actually questionable. So I think part of the problem here is that a lot of productivity goes into building things that have the basic functionality, but don't actually have a perceptible functionality. And so you're wasting a lot of productivity on making things that don't actually have a robust or long-term value and are going to cause people more stress than they actually do them good. Of course, we know that design itself is a non-recurring cost. So once you create a design, you can distribute it and reproduce it as long as your unit cost is low enough. So obviously, like a high quality piece of clothing is not something that's reproducible. It has to be made once. So currently, we're a little bit stuck in the design gap. Of course, things like public works are great, but if the only source of beauty for you is a couple of very generous people who make design architecture, they make that very available to the public, you're not going to get very far. That's not really the culture. That's not really the foundation of modern society, having public works of design is a little bit of an outlier. Mostly public works are supposed to be very functional and very inoffensive, which actually makes them more offensive. And it's kind of sad that they don't just take the risks to, if everything is designed, and some things are horrible to certain people, at least the next 9 things are going to be at least semi-appealing to them if you have variety in there instead of complete monotony. And part of that is the user experience of doing something like driving, doing something like navigating a complicated infrastructure or a new city. But when it comes to cities that we value, other than accessibility, those considerations, they don't really play into the value of the city. Even if it makes your commute 5% easier, why would you even commute there? So what do we do about this? Well, of course, the first thing we should do, a significant amount of the costing of public projects, of things that are going to be standard, we have to have designers be looking at those first. So what can make these fit in with an environment? What can make them good for the stress and overall health and sense of wonder of people who live in cities? And of course, upcoming technology. So as we move forward, it's impossible to predict the future, but chances are environment's going to be a little bit more virtual. So augmented and virtual space is probably going to play a bigger role, because it's just, you can have unlimited amounts of it. It's just so much more economical. In a big city like I am, living in Toronto, it's so obvious the price of space is so high, but the price of the power to simulate that space, like say you're playing like Minecraft or one of those open world video games, of course you can have a ridiculous amount of space for almost no money. So if that becomes a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more believable, and a little bit more interactive, I think we're going to start to see that space creep into our day-to-day lives. And when it does, there's now a 0 unit cost for reproducing design. So the same way that we stream music, maybe we can subscribe to designers so we can get their environmental attributes for our virtual space, for our augmented space, right? Things that don't need to be physical, things that don't have a mechanical purpose, just have a spatial purpose, right? But that's purely speculative. For now, I think we need to take design more seriously. I think we need to understand that there are real issues that are caused in our life when we don't have access to aesthetics. There are real benefits of having access to aesthetics, and it's another unnecessary gap between rich and poor that leads to just general ill will and negative emotions. That's something that we need to be tracking as we move into a post-scarcity environment.